U.S. officials charged WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange with violating the Espionage Act.
Assange faces up to 170 years in prison.
Publishing of classified information runs afoul of the law. So does the work of just about every single...
So what is journalism? What is whistleblowing? And what is spying?
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're covering this week. The U.S. Department of Justice raises the stakes in its case against WikiLeaks. Is Julian Assange on trial, or is American journalism? Israel and the documentation of Palestinian memory, the archives it keeps under lock and key. Beijing versus Washington.
Many American companies have been established in China, and they're very profitable. And
Trade wars turn into anchor wars. And Hunger Games, fasting and furious for Ramadan. 7 weeks ago, when Julian Assange of WikiLeaks was dragged out of that embassy in London, headed for possible extradition to the United States, the site's editor, Kristinn Hrafnsson, told us the legal charges waiting for him in the U.S. were just the tip of the iceberg, that there would be more coming. And last week, he was proven correct. U.S. prosecutors have expanded the indictment against Assange by another 17 counts. His maximum jail term has jumped from 5 years to 175 years. And the U.S. Department of Justice is going after him under a different law now, the Espionage Act. That law has been used against whistleblowers before, WikiLeaks source Chelsea Manning included, but never against a publisher. The alarm bells, including from mainstream media organizations that fear the precedent such a prosecution would set, have been going off ever since. The Assange case isn't really about him or WikiLeaks anymore. It has implications, serious ones, for journalists just about everywhere. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C. This indictment, all 37 pages and 18 charges in it, is the U.S. Department of Justice putting its cards on the table, laying out its hand. Should Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, having been expelled from the Ecuadorean embassy in London, be extradited to the United States, then he will be tried under the Espionage Act. It is ironic that the charges also serve as a different kind of indictment.
Is he a criminal or is he a journalist?
Of all those journalists and news outlets, all the alleged experts and legal analysts who initially argued that the case against Assange was his to fight alone.
So you really think we, and I'll say we, I'm a journalist, you think we have it wrong and that he is actually not a pariah. We should be praising him and
that there were no implications for more conventional news organizations, because the real indictment provides prima facie evidence to the contrary.
For about 5 decades, it's been well understood since the Pentagon Papers case that the U.S. Constitution, and specifically the First Amendment to the Constitution, protects the receipt and publication of government secrets. And this is the first time the government has brought a charge under the 1917 World War I era Espionage Act, which is supposed to cover spying, not disclosing information to journalists. It's the first time that the government has brought charges under the Espionage Act based exclusively on the receipt and publication of government secrets.
This would foreclose and in fact obstruct all kinds of journalism throughout the United States and from other countries in the world. There is no legally meaningful difference between the work that WikiLeaks engaged in and the work that the New York Times or the Washington Post engaged in. And in fact, we know this to be true because President Barack Obama's administration declined to pursue a prosecution against WikiLeaks back in 2013. They were faced with something called the New York Times problem, which was if they prosecuted WikiLeaks, then they would essentially be saying that they had the authority to pursue and prosecute a reporter or a news editor at the New York Times.
When the Department of Justice announced the indictment, it held a closed-door briefing for reporters, on the record but off camera. The head of the department's National Security Division was widely quoted on Julian Assange's journalistic credentials. The department takes seriously the role of journalists in our democracy, he said. It is not, and never has been, the department's policy to target them for reporting. But Julian Assange is no journalist.
The question about whether Julian Assange is a journalist or not is irrelevant. The First Amendment does not bestow upon journalists a certain set of rights. They bestow everybody those rights, whether they call themselves a journalist or not. Luckily, we live in a country where the government does not license journalists. I think everyone can agree that Donald Trump shouldn't be the one deciding who is a journalist and who isn't.
The DOJ has highlighted a narrow set of facts that distinguish Julian Assange and WikiLeaks from traditional responsible journalists. Those include the alleged agreement to crack a government password and the irresponsible publication of the names of human sources. Neither of those things are activities that journalists would typically engage in. However, the indictment includes charges that relate to the solicitation, the receipt, and the publication of classified information. And those are things that good national security reporters do every day.
The use of the Espionage Act by the Department of Justice galvanized media outlets alarmed at the implications, not for Julian Assange, for themselves. The Washington Post called the case a blueprint for making journalists into felons. The New York Times' editorial board said the indictment aims at the heart of the First Amendment. And The Guardian's former editor called the charges a grave threat to free media. All that pushback felt like too little, too late. Julian Assange has been treated like a pariah by those same news outlets. Take the New York Times. In 2010, The Times, the UK's Guardian, and Germany's Der Spiegel all collaborated with WikiLeaks, resulting in the publication of the Iraq war logs. It was big news, but on day 2 of that story, The Times ran a lengthy profile piece on Assange, describing him as imperious, dictatorial, saying he was given to delusional grandeur. It was an odd way to treat a collaborator on one of the paper's biggest stories in decades. And when Assange later sought refuge in the Ecuadorean embassy in London, saying he feared for his freedom, The Times, as well as The Guardian, failed in their editorials to come to his defense. The sexual assault allegations in Sweden may have affected their thinking, but anyone familiar with that case and the numerous irregularities in the prosecution's handling of it would have to be suspicious of the motives at play. And even now, with all the Assange indictments out there, those news outlets are clearly more concerned with the possible legal precedents affecting them than they are about the fate of their one-time source.
The news media organizations that have reacted to this with alarm have done so with a full appreciation of the signal that this indictment sends to the press. You can be critical of Julian Assange. There may be many good reasons to take issue with the way that Assange has conducted himself and the way that WikiLeaks has released information to the public. But the charges brought against him in this indictment sweep much more broadly into the realm of typical journalistic practice.
If media organizations could do it all over again, I would suggest that they go back to 2010 when the grand jury was first impaneled against WikiLeaks, and they speak out loudly against the Obama administration pursuing this dissident media organization.
Of the substantial leak of documents
because what was happening back then was laying the groundwork for investigations that could target more traditional media organizations, whether they were based in the United States or outside of the United States.
The rise of WikiLeaks is attributable not only to the advent of technology, but also to changes in U.S. government policy. Since the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the American defense and intelligence establishments have gone on a classification binge in the name of national security. More and more material, field reports, assessments, interagency communications, the kind that used to be available to the public, have now been classified. An organization like WikiLeaks, that makes no secret that it's in the business of stealing secrets, has plenty to work with. And there's a market out there, millions of clicks to be had, that news outlets are well aware of, and the American authorities are too.
What they are essentially trying to do here is change that dynamic. They're saying we're going to prosecute Julian Assange for publishing classified secrets, but we may not stop there. That our court systems have this precedent that then can be used against other news organizations. And this is why many people are saying that this is really just a stalking horse for the Trump administration to go after other journalists.
And without the receipt and publication of classified information, without the free flow of that information to the public, many of the most important national security stories of the past 5 decades, including the Pentagon Papers, but also including torture post 9/11, mass surveillance after 9/11, all of these stories could not have been written without legal protections for reporters accessing classified information and occasionally publishing it.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Marcela Pizarro. Marcela, this past Wednesday, we saw a trade war, the one between the U.S. and China, turned into a television spectacle, and the anchors involved weren't just moderating this debate, they were in fact debating. So let's start with the channels involved.
Yes, well, the debate pitted an anchor for Fox's business channel, Trish Regan, against Liu Xin of China's state-owned English-language broadcaster CGTN. For weeks, these two had been trading tweets about tariffs, trade wars and technology. Eventually, Regan challenged Liu to a live showdown. The format was far from journalistic, with these two presenters arguing, in effect, on behalf of their respective governments in Washington and Beijing.
How do American businesses operate in China if they're at risk for having their property, their ideas, their hard work stolen?
You have to ask American businesses whether they wanted to come to China, whether they find coming to China and cooperating with Chinese businesses has not been profitable or not, and they will tell you their answers. As far as I understand, many American companies have been established in China, and they're very profitable and the great.
So you have two anchors acting as surrogate spokespeople for their respective governments. How did this program go down in China?
Before the debate, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry bigged up the event, asking everyone to watch it because, you know, in China, we have a saying, the truth becomes clearer through debate. It was a rare opportunity to have Beijing's position on an ongoing trade dispute broadcast on an American channel. Liu Xin was an obvious choice for the Chinese side, since she has a reputation for being scornful of Western media coverage on China. Now, did the audiences get anything out of it? Tough to say. The debate went on for 16 minutes, and Regan and Liu had nothing much to add on the trade wars to what's already been reported. But it'll be interesting and maybe a bit disturbing to see if this kind of debate, network versus network, grows more common.
Okay. Thanks, Marcela. Turning now to a story about memory, how knowledge of the past is produced and kept hidden in a place where history and its narration is highly contested, Israel and Palestine. For years, material that could reveal details about Israel's treatment of Palestinians has been sealed inside the country's state and military archives under the pretext of security or privacy. More than 98% of those documents are classified. They're under lock and key. It's a form of censorship that has been criticized, not just by Palestinians, but by the former chief archivist of Israel as well. Historians and journalists say the policy of censoring material in the archives exposes the deep insecurities that Israel has about its past, with archivists acting as the gatekeepers of history. For Palestinians, it's part of a wider trend of cultural erasure and historical denial that, beginning before 1948, has gone hand in hand with the regular theft and appropriation of not just their land, but of their story. The Listening Post's Tarek Nafa now on the silencing of Palestinian history in Israel's archives.
For Palestinians, displaced, dispersed, occupied, narrating the past is a constant struggle, which is by design, because sealed in Israel's archives and libraries are hidden Palestinian stories, entire chapters of history that were looted from Palestinian institutions and homes.
After the Palestinian people were expelled from their homes, Israeli forces came in and quite methodically proceeded to seize all of the contents in their houses. It was done in such a way that to this day, we don't have a complete idea of what items were taken. Documents are scattered in so many places, some in the Israeli archives in Jerusalem, some at the National Library. Many of these boxes haven't been catalogued to this day. There is often no possibility for a researcher to have access to them.
All of the archives in Israel are really very much founded on the erasure of Palestinians. Every single Israeli attack on Palestinians has usually targeted an archive. This happened in 1948 en masse, and also in 1982 when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and targeted the Institute of Palestine Studies. One of the reasons that they're threatening is because they're really a record of Palestinian social life and Palestine more broadly.
There are important items like the personal papers of Palestinian leaders and intellectuals, like Khalil al-Sakakini's library in Jerusalem, considered one of the most important Palestinian private libraries. Then you have Palestinian lawyers whose entire offices and files were seized. To this day, if you go to the archives, you'll find there's a Palestinian lawyers category, which I find strange. Palestinian lawyers, these are very private documents. The fact that they have been taken away is a sign of contempt for Palestinian history. It's an attempt to suggest Palestinians have no history, no documents, no belongings.
Israel's archive law says that anyone can access the state archives. The most sensitive material can be censored for up to 70 years. But in practice, the state can and has restricted indefinitely anything it decides is damaging to its national security. Israeli historian Rana Sela has spent 20 years trawling the archives, uncovering troves of previously unseen footage and photographs seized as far back as the 1930s.
Can't you hear the urgent call of Palestine?
In 2017, she made a film about lost Palestinian histories called Looted and Hidden. Over the years, Sela has found historical material that has been sealed for decades. In Israel's military archives, she discovered films from the era of Palestinian revolutionary cinema and photos shot by one of the founders of Palestinian photojournalism, Khalil Rassas. Sela also uncovered aerial photos taken by the Jewish militia, the Haganah, of Palestinian villages before they were destroyed and repopulated in 1948.
The Haganah decided to photograph all the Palestinian villages from the air. This material would later be used for the conquest and rule of these places and their people. However, when we look at the photos with the historic perspective we have today, their meaning can flip, so to speak, and they can reveal the history of those who were conquered. Someone once asked me if I wasn't concerned that these materials might be closed off after I'd asked them to be opened. And indeed, the material has been reclassified. When I went back to the archive a few years later, I was told the photos do not exist.
It's not just that material is censored, hidden from the outside world. Once inside the archive, its origin is erased, reinterpreted to fit a different narrative.
When I started working with material from the archive, I saw photos with comments and notes written on them by the censors and archivists. For example, Palestinians are described as terrorists, as gangs. Seeing all of that taught me about how the materials go through a process of rewriting to aid or benefit the Zionist narrative. So the colonial apparatus that starts with the plunder and looting continues with colonial control and management.
The role the archives play in reshaping history is under the control of political masters. Israel's military archive is managed by the Defense Ministry, its state archive by the Prime Minister's office. Before stepping down last year, Israel's most senior archivist, Yaakov Lozovic, criticized not only that lack of independence, but also the state's tendency to censor material under the guise of security. Lozovic declined to speak to us for this story. However, in a revealing report summing up his term as chief archivist, he wrote, "The vast majority of material is sealed and will never be opened." According to the Israeli NGO, Akivot, of the 14.8 million files held by Israel's state and military archives, less than 2% are accessible to the public. That includes restricted material that could expose Israelis to uncomfortable truths about their history, like war crimes perpetrated against Palestinians.
Israel is terrified of the contents of its own archives and doesn't want its history to be exposed. Take one of the most important examples of censored material, the Kafr Qasim massacre in 1956. Many scholars argue that Israel used the Kafr Qasim massacre to force those Palestinians who had stayed on their land to flee. I believe there were direct orders from the government for the massacre to take place. So as long as the state keeps censoring these documents, it means it's trying to hide the past, to prevent it from being part of the present and the future.
Who is allowed to remember and who is made to forget is an expression of power. Erasing the archival record denies Palestinians the right to narrate their past and to connect it to their present. But Israel does not have a monopoly over history. In the occupied West Bank, a major project is underway by the Palestine Museum to collect and digitize hundreds of thousands of items of historical significance. In the face of continuing historical denial, Palestinians are finding other ways to preserve collective memory.
Archival fever, or this attempt to really record and collate these histories and stories, has been from the very beginning a part of the Palestinian struggle for memory and, to a certain extent, for liberation. There is no single authoritative Palestinian archive. That may be a blessing in disguise, because the more voices and the more multiplicity we have, I think all of those things are sources of richness, not poverty.
I don't think that Palestinian history should be deprived of documents and evidence. It is important to return the material to the owners so that it won't be me, someone with privilege and access, who writes the Palestinians' history, but rather Palestinian researchers themselves. Israeli society must learn to respect, acknowledge, and understand Palestinian society and its history, because without that, there's no future for this place.
Finally, Fasting and Furious. That's not the mispronounced name of the film franchise. It's a spoof rap video, an ode to Ramadan and fasting. No food, no water from dawn until sunset. And it's coming to an end this week. It's an act of faith and of discipline, one that can make Muslims hungry and slightly irritable. This next video was produced by a Jordanian and an Indian, a couple of musicians who have a YouTube channel called Jordindian. Judging from the numbers, more than 1 million views within days of its release. This video has hit a nerve, if not the spot. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
I'm a fasting Arab and I'm very, very furious. Wondering what's for iftar makes me very, very curious. Waiting all day for the sunset to arrive. Cause if it doesn't come on time, then no one will survive. Cause we're fasting and furious, crazy delirious. Driving my Mercedes fast, don't get a car. Shouting at my kids all day. Find out how much we pay. Stay the hell out of my way. Because we're fasting and furious, crazy delirious. Crossing at the traffic jam, thinking about the love. Can't hold hands with my babe. Haram, that's what she say. Waiting for the end of day. I wake up 4 a.m. to stuff my face with some food. Cause if I do not eat sahur, I will have bad mood. Eat some chicken, eat a jet. Eat some lahme with my dad. Sleep all day, that's not bad. Wake up iftar, eat kebab. The only date I go on is the one to break my fast. For iftar, eat it first, but suhoor, I eat it last. If ladies come up to me saying they can't resist my charm, I tell them call me after it, cause right now it's haram. Cause I got hummus on my mind, hummus on my mind. Falafel on the side, falafel on the side. Shawarma looking fine, yes, looking fine. Just trying to pass the time, trying to pass the time. We fasting and furious.